Today is the 13th of August 2015, and I'm in the parliamentary offices of Mr. Roger Godsiff MP. And I'm recording this interview for a proposed website and interviews with other Labour figures to be called Labour Lives. So perhaps at this time I can ask you to tell me first of all how you got involved in Labour Party and your background in that area.
Okay, well I joined the Labour Party in 1965. I became interested in politics when I was at school. My father was an active trade unionist. I became interested in politics at school. I used to particularly like history, and I suppose that whetted my appetite for politics. And I first became involved in politics in the 1966 general election, where I did some volunteer work for the Labour Party, canvassing, number taking. And it just rolled on from there. After the 66 election, I became more involved, and it hasn't stopped since.
You were born and brought up in Lewisham, is that right?
Yeah, that's right, in South London.
Yes. You are 69, born, as I understand it, 28th of June 1946.
That's right.
And you describe your involvement in the Labour Party early on, but you also got elected very early on in your life.
Yeah, I got elected to Lewisham Council in 1971. I stood in 1968 in the council elections, which was a very bad year for Labour. I lost that election, like just about everybody else. 1971 was a very good year for Labour, and I was elected, and I remained a councillor for 19 years. And
at a young age you became mayor, I believe.
It's quite true. In 1977, which was the Queen's Jubilee year, I became mayor of Lewisham. That's right.
A year that Wikipedia says you also got married. So, but that's maybe right. That was wrong.
No,
that's
that would be right as well. Yeah.
So you first of all went in, I think, to banking as a career. Is that right?
I did. Yeah. When I left school, I worked for Coutts Bank.
Yes.
For
that's the private bank.
It's the Queen's Bank.
Indeed.
For 3 years, and then, because I had become active in politics, I had the opportunity of going on a short study course to Germany, which I did. And the guy who was with me was working for, one of the guys who was with me was working for a trade union called Apex. And we became friendly, and then he contacted me out of the blue shortly afterwards to say there was a job going, his job actually, because he was becoming an organiser. There was a job going at Apex if I would care to apply, and he put in a word for me, which I did. I got the job, and the rest is history.
You're still involved in trade union, in the trade union that was taken over, if you like. The GMB took over.
They merged. That's right. They became part of the GMB.
Yeah.
I still have an involvement with the GMB, but I wouldn't say it's a close one. But I mean, GMB know that if they have any issue on which they think I can be helpful, then I'm quite happy to help them, and I do some of their courses and schools and such like. So I still retain my connections with GMB.
And of course, the Labour Party, founded by the unions, essentially, right, with socialist societies.
That's right. The Labour Party was set up by trade unions in 1906, Labour Representation Committee. So yes, the trade unions were the backbones of the Labour Party.
And should still be, in your view?
Well, they should be, because the trade unions represent working people, nowadays. Particularly on the right of politics, they like to characterise trade unions as being Luddite disruptors of society, but the trade unions are just ordinary men and women, and certainly in this day and age, if anything is wrong, it is that trade unions aren't strong enough. That's the reason why we have a low-paid economy. That's why so many people are being paid minimum wages and such like, because they don't have proper representation in order to bid up those wages. So the whole balance in industrial society has swung very much now towards the employers, towards capital, and ordinary working people who are trade union members and who don't have membership of trade unions are the ones who suffer.
Indeed, of course, in terms of Birmingham, of course, it was traditionally said that Birmingham was for want of a better title, a right-wing trade union part of the world from the sort of post-45 era, because trade unions were fairly strong, but also, of course, employment was amazingly low in the West Midlands from 45 up until, I suppose, the early part of unemployment up until the 1960s or so.
Yeah, I think there's a truism in that. I mean, Birmingham developed very much as Birmingham's always been a city of immigrants, whether it be immigrants from Scotland, Wales, Ireland, after the Second World War from the West Indies, and then in the 50s from the Indian subcontinent and on. So Birmingham's always been a city of immigrants. But historically, Birmingham has been a working class conservative city. And that working class conservatism has certainly extended into the 1960s. For example, in the 1964 election, you had seats like Sparkbrook, which was still held by the Conservatives. You had seats like Handsworth, also held by the Conservatives. In fact, I think the Handsworth constituency was held by a very prominent Tory, and it wasn't until 1965 that Roy Hassey, for example, was elected as the MP for Sparkbrook. And of course, in the West Midlands, you've had characters like Enoch Powell representing the Wolverhampton seat. So yeah, Birmingham and the West Midlands grew up as working class conservatism, and I suppose to some extent that almost goes back to the Joseph Chamberlain influence, although Chamberlain originally started off as a Liberal. I suppose the big change that's taken place in Birmingham, politically, Birmingham has moved more and more towards Labour. That has been synonymous with the change in demographics of the population in Birmingham, and also to some extent with the demise of the engineering industry, the metal bashing industry, and more Birmingham has come to rely on services, and particularly local government services. So the demographics of Birmingham's electorate has changed over the years.
If we wind back to 45, I think it's fair to say that obviously it was a super successful election for the Labour Party. In Birmingham, I think the Labour Party recorded one of the biggest swings to Labour across the country in the 20s, something like 21, 22%. Do you have any view of why that might have been the case, with your wide knowledge of politics generally?
In 1945, there was a massive desire for a change in society. Britain had just fought a world war. Britain financially was almost bankrupt. It had a debt ratio of more than 200% to GDP. The people who voted in the 1945 general election were, many of them were in the armed services. Many of them had been through the deprivations of the 1930s and such like, and there was a massive desire amongst the electorate for a change of direction of the country. And although the war leader Winston Churchill was personally popular, the Conservative Party didn't offer anything for a home for heroes, and those heroes wanted a better life, and that's why they elected a radical Labour government who carried out an enormous amount in those 5-6 years it was in power.
Of course, there hadn't been any elections for something like nearly 10 years, I think, had there?
Well, there had been elections during the war, but they weren't contested ones.
Yes.
A party called the Commonwealth Party won a number of by-elections during the war, which in itself might well have been a foretaste of what came about in 1945, because during the war, the coalition parties in the war cabinet didn't contest against each other in the by-elections, and therefore you had a number of by-elections came about where the Commonwealth Party overturned big majorities by incumbent Tory MPs or Liberal MPs, and that ought to have given an indication of the way the mood of the electorate was changing.
Yes. So, in terms of your own background, we have you being elected early on, standing for election when you were 21 or 22, then becoming a councillor at 25, mayor at 31, and then leaving local politics in 1990, I understand.
Yeah.
Whilst you were in a councillor, you were obviously telling me about your role in Apex. It's described as a political officer in some papers or that I've read.
Well,
Can you define what that was, a political officer?
Well, when I went to work for Apex, I went there as a conference officer, and I worked in a department of 3 people. Myself, another guy, and a secretary, on organising all the unions' conferences, their annual conference and such like. And during that time, there was a new president of the union, who was Dennis Howe, who was the Member of Parliament for Small Heath. He'd been a long-standing member of the union. And
extremely active in Labour politics in Birmingham, of course.
Very much
Labour man through and through.
Exactly. And he was elected as president of Apex, so obviously I had a lot to do with him in terms of organising conferences and things like that. But then it would be after 1979 general election that he, when Labour lost, he became quite concerned about his own seat and such like, he spoke to the General Secretary of Apex about, the union needs to be more politically active and motivated and such like, and I was in the prime position to take over that role, which is what I did. So I actually became involved in Small Heath, both in terms of doing work for him there, but in terms of the wider work of the union, political work. My job changed, and that's what I did. I did the union's political work.
It's interesting, the Golding book, the Hammer of the Left, as it's called. Not a title perhaps that he would have used, but one that he referred to, I think, with a certain amount of pride.
Yeah, John would have used that. He'd accept that without any trouble at all.
He was we'll come back to him in a moment, if I may do, but the involvement in the political officer role was as a counterweight to what was seen as the entryism that was coming into the Labour Party, into trade unions from Trotskyists, effectively, the militant tendency. Tell us something about what you feel about that.
Particularly into the Labour Party, there was entryism. It was a tactic of the militant tendency. Unlike some other Trotskyite groups who, like the Socialist Workers' Party, who ploughed their own furrow, rowed their own boat, call it what you will, and hoisted their individualistic banner on the left fringe of British politics. The tactics that militant used was entryism. It was a policy decision taken by the High Command of militant, and they succeeded to some considerable degree in certain areas. In London, they certainly had an influence. In the West Midlands, for example, Dave Nellis, who was elected as a Member of Parliament in Coventry, he ended up being expelled from the Labour Party as a member of the militant tendency.
Indeed, it was. There were very troubling times.
Yeah, they were.
In fact, you early, it seems to me, in reading the Golding book, developed an ability to be able to outwit some of those forces, and perhaps I can come to that. But I took a few of what might be described as some of the things that John Golding described you as. He refers to you as somebody staying in the shadows. He refers also to you as being a fixer, a man who could conjure rabbits out of a hat, the master of calculation, a seasoned operator, a polished performer. Are those accolades that you wear with a certain pride, or do you challenge what John Golding's view of you was?
No, I don't.
Or is?
No, I wouldn't dream of John of saying that what John Golding said is not correct, but it's also very generous of him, to give those accolades. But yeah, that was the work I did. And essentially, after the disastrous Wembley conference, where the Electoral College was sent up to decide who elected the leader of the Labour Party, and that was a precursor to the formation of the SDP and their breakaway from the Labour Party. And the Labour Party was in one hell of a mess, and there was enormous concern amongst the majority of moderate trade unions that the Labour Party could become totally unelectable again in the future. Certain trade unions were controlled by the left, some with very strong militant and Trotskyite influence, but the majority of trade unions were moderate, for the want of a better description, and wanted the Labour Party to be re-elected again, because only through that could they see them achieving their objectives for their members, and there was a meeting that took place after that disastrous conference at the Charing Cross Hotel in London, right by Charing Cross, above Charing Cross Station. And at that meeting, just about every single trade union, a moderate trade union or moderate element within the trade unions was represented there. And there were also people like Dennis Healy was there, even Frank Chappell, the leader of the electricians union, was there, which was unusual because him and the GMB, although politically they were on the moderate wing of the Labour Party, they personally didn't like each other, but even he turned up for a sort of a cameo appearance. And it was at that meeting that the so-called, that the moderate group began to get itself together, and that then turned into what was called the St Ermin's group after they moved from Charing Cross Hotel to St Ermin's Hotel in London. Actually, they didn't finish there because for a number of years they actually met, instead of at the St Ermin's, they met at the headquarters of the ISTC in London, right up until the time when basically the group had worked itself out of existence because it achieved all the objectives that it wanted and needed to achieve. But it was...
was the principal objective stop a certain person or stop a certain group? Or
well, the principal objective was to win back control of the NEC and to use the... to coordinate, and that was my job and the job of John Golding, John Speller, in different ways, the three of us, was to take control of the NEC. If you take control of the NEC, you control the machinery of the party, and it also meant that you could give the leader of the party a supportive NEC rather than what Jim Callaghan had, which was an NEC that was basically at war with him all the time. And it was also to stop Tony Benn becoming deputy leader of the Labour Party and to get Dennis Healy elected, and using exactly the same organisational tactics that was also achieved. Very narrow margins, but you just have to make sure the numbers stacked up.
And you were the numbers man?
I was, yeah. I did numbers.
Yeah.
Made the deals.
Right. For some people outside politics, they find all of that slightly worrying. For those of us who've been involved in Labour politics and trade union politics, doing deals is no different from anything else.
Oh, exactly.
But from some people, they would say at conference, that's where the real power was wielded, and that the unions use their power to put their, for want of a better word, place persons or get their slates organised to make sure that their candidates were elected to the NEC. You make no bones about that, presumably now looking back over those years.
No, not at all. And the fact of the matter was, you see, the reason why the moderates, for the want of a better description, some would say the right wing, but the moderates, as opposed to the left-stroke Benite section of the party, moderates always had a numerical majority amongst the trade unions. What they've never done is to coordinate their activities and to work together. So it was more a question of instilling belief in them that, look, they can get their person onto the NEC, but you do that by also trying to ensure that you get a slate of people on the same ticket on there, so that if you take control of the NEC, you have control of all the committees. And until there was a degree of coordination, that had never happened. So what would happen is you would get unions making unofficial alliances. you would get, for example, the railway workers, the miners and the steel workers would all vote for each other's candidate, not because they had ideological similarity, because by then the miners were heading towards Arthur Scargill, and Mick McGahey of the Scottish miners, was one of the vice presidents of the NUM. So the NUM was left. The RMT, the RAL, the NUR, they were sort of in the middle, and the ISTC was right. Yet they all voted for each other's candidate. The Triple Alliance, you had Unison, would vote for the GMB candidate. But the end product of that was that you didn't get a change in the overall complexion of the NEC, and that the moderates ended up in a minority on the NEC. What had to be done was to basically say, look, if you do it the way I'm outlining, I will get your candidate on there. But it might be he won't get on with 6 million votes. He might only get on with 4 million votes, because those other 2 million votes I'll transfer to another candidate of a moderate union who needs those votes in order to beat a left-winger. That's how you do it.
And in those discussions, did you find it difficult to get that message over?
No, because success breeds upon success. Almost immediately after the meeting, the Labour Party conference, the first Labour Party conference, was the one where Healey won by less than 1% of the vote, and where there were 5 people elected to the NEC, 2 from the women's section, 2 from the trade union section, and Eric Varley knocked out Atkinson as treasurer. And people could see there was, success breeds success, and they thought, it's working. Once it's working, people are much happier to sign up rather than on a wing and a prayer. But what galvanised them was there was a genuine fear after that terrible 79 conference, the Wembley conference, that the Labour Party could actually end up being superseded by the SDP.
So we all know that conference has historically been attended by huge amounts of people from local parties who tend to be left, for want of a better word, and I think some of these
more left.
They're the more activists. They're more involved, perhaps, and they have more left leaning. Interestingly enough, Golding talks about the notion of the actual setup of the Labour Party and how it was, even in the 50s and 60s, it was easy to take over a branch of a Labour Party.
Oh, yeah.
And he describes them as the middle classes getting together, and the intellectuals, for want of a better word. He didn't have a great deal of time for them. I take that from the book.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel now, given today's news about the huge amount of people who've joined up as affiliate members through unions, or as the £3 voters, or whatever you want to call them, in terms of the Labour Party today? Because it strikes me that as a Labour Party member who has who votes in Hall Green, which has had special measures for as long as people can almost remember, and has had difficulties, we all have to get super vetted, sending almost a vial of our DNA off to the Labour Party to join, and yet people can sign up for £3 and influence the Labour Party fundamentally. Where do you feel about that?
Well, you have to look and see how this idea of registered membership came to pass. Traditionally, unions affiliated to the Labour Party on the basis of the number of members who paid the political fund contribution.
Mm.
So that, for example, in the case of NUPE, National Union of Public Employees, they in 1979, prior to the Wembley Conference, they had something like 500,000 members affiliated to the Labour Party out of a membership of about 700,000. What happened in 1979 at that Wembley Conference was that just before the conference, the union, Unison, actually increased its affiliation by 100,000. And the key vote at the Wembley Conference was carried by less than 100,000. I mean, what's being pointed now at unions is not something that suddenly happened. In 1979, the Wembley Conference, which caused the breakaway of Jenkins and Williams, Owen, Rogers, was caused because a trade union, NUPE, increased its membership, its affiliated membership to the Labour Party by 100,000, and the key vote at that conference was carried because of that 100,000 affiliation, extra affiliation by NUPE. Anyway, that's how unions used to affiliate to the Labour Party, and for as long as I can remember, there have been arguments in the Labour Party about the fact, well, the unions dominate conference with their affiliated. And I actually did a paper early in 1980 as these changes were taking place in the NEC, suggesting that we move towards a tripartite system where, for example, MPs had a section where they could vote, where members had a separate section, and where unions had a section. And actually, we are quite a way towards that at the moment. But what happened with this registered membership was that 2 years ago, there was a big row in Falkirk about allegedly a union, Unite, trying to impose its own candidate there. And of course the right-wing press had a field day on it, and Miliband's people panicked, and prompted by Tony Blair and Mandelson saying, yes, you really should. Says Blair, I totally agree with what you're doing. I wish I'd have done it when I was Prime Minister. Anyway, the end product was that they went and changed the basis of affiliation to the Labour Party, and brought in this membership, this registered membership thing, which was, in my opinion, a nonsense from day one. And in fairness to Jeremy Corbyn, he did say a couple of days ago, I did say at the time that I thought this might come back to haunt the Labour Party, and he's absolutely right. And I don't think enough thought was given to it. I think it was a silly manoeuvre. I think anybody who had experience of what happened with entryism before would have been able to see what could happen by allowing people to sign up for £3 to participate in the leadership election, and that has come to pass. Now, what is the political situation now, as opposed to when Tony Benn was the so-called leader of the left back in the late 60s, early 70s? The situation is very different. I'm not an advocate of Jeremy Corbyn, although there are a number of things that he and I agree on, but there are others I don't agree with him, and he wouldn't agree with me. But the fact of the matter is, he is not Tony Benn. One of the reasons why Tony Benn was so divisive in the Labour Party was he had been a minister in the governments of Wilson during the 60s and Callaghan in the 70s. And he basically took over the role of criticising what the Labour cabinets had done, of which he'd been a part. You know, instead of resigning as Nye Bevan did and Harold Wilson did back in 1951 over the issue of prescription charges, he stayed as a member of those cabinets and yet was the leader of the insurgents against it. That was one of the reasons why he generated so much personal bitterness from people, particularly people who served in that government and MPs who backed it, who felt he was just a charlatan. Now, whether that was true or not, you pay your money and take your choice. But he was extremely divisive because of it. Whatever you think of Jeremy Corbyn, you can't put that label on him because he's never been an insider. He's always been an outsider. So he's got no baggage. And nobody can turn around and say, oh, well, you took the King's shilling when it suited you, and then, next minute you're the leader of the insurgents trying to become, probably Corbyn's never been an insider all his life. So that situation is very different from what it was, and furthermore, the political situation back at that time is different to what it is now. I mean, some would argue, and I would be amongst those, that with the advent of Mrs. Thatcher, the election of Mrs. Thatcher back in 1979, and with the election of President Reagan and the introduction of neoliberal economic policies, deregulation, etc., 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 that has been a revolution that ran from middle of 83 right through until 2008 and the crash, the financial crash. That included a period of Labour government under Tony Blair where some would argue, including myself, that although that government did a number of good things, there were also some missed opportunities, and more than anything, it was Thatcherism with a human face. Because, for example, Tony Blair, one of the first things he did when he became leader of the Labour Party was go and see Thatcher, talk to Thatcher. Okay, he's perfectly entitled to talk to who he wants to. But he talked to Thatcher, and one of the things that Thatcher said in one of her, I think it was her biography, where she was asked what was her greatest achievement as Prime Minister, and she said Tony Blair and New Labour, because essentially they've signed up to the Thatcherite revolution. I believe that to be the case, and I believe that we missed opportunities, and I think we also laid the ground, I regret to say, for example, with academy schools. When academy schools were brought in, the argument was, well, this is just to address the issue of failing schools. And the Tories supported us because they saw that as the first step towards the breakup of state education. Now, I don't think many people who supported Tony believe that he did that deliberately. But Tony Blair's instincts were always that the market can solve everything.
But he was also, you're speaking to me from a sofa, but he is the man who was supposed to be the greatest sofa politician.
Oh, he was.
He had a coterie of 2 or 3 close advisors and never really went to the House of Commons.
Steve, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. He was a great communicator, and you can't take that away from him. I mean, Tony Blair could sell ice to the Eskimos. Apart from Reagan and Bill Clinton, Tony Blair was the best I've ever seen in terms of the great communicator. You know, his hand gestures, the way he talked and such like, the self-deprecating way he talked. He was a brilliant communicator, and you know, I certainly, you know, would not deny that for one single minute. That's a world of difference, however, to whether he was a great politician or whether he was a great leader, or, well, I suppose this is the point I really make, whether he was a man of great political substance. I would say he wasn't. I mean, if you put him with Clement Attlee, Clement Attlee and his government achieved far more in those 6 years in much more difficult circumstances than his government achieved. Now, okay, the government led by Tony Blair brought in, for example, working tax credits. Good, that helped a lot of working people, but be under no illusion, that was basically the taxpayer subsidising bad employers.
And as a trade unionist, that's something that you saw losing your role in the party and as trade unions, because they didn't have the industrial might.
No, but it doesn't matter who improves the lives of working people, whether it be politicians or trade union. Working tax credits helped a hell of a lot of people, but it was subsidising bad employers. As simple as that, people who wouldn't pay. It was all part of a low-wage economy, the neoliberal, race to the bottom and such like, outsourcing, which meant you got lower pay and that, and therefore, rather than have people at the bottom suffer too much, the state steps in and puts in place a whole series of working tax credits and that, basically to subsidise your low pay. Now, to the person who receives it, I suppose at the end of the day, if their weekly take-home pay is 200 quid a week, they don't really mind whether they get £100 from the state and £100 from their employer. But it wasn't. It was all part of this neoliberal agenda, this race to the bottom, this deregulation and such like. And the same thing happened in hospitals. The setting up of hospital trust, Foundation Hospital. Now, I voted against that, and also voted against academy schools, not because I was opposed to the idea of giving more autonomy to schools or giving more autonomy to hospitals, although I've seen so many reorganisations of the NHS, and by and large you just end up back at stage one. The only people who benefited out of it have been the market consultants and the managers of the NHS, who've had a revolving door and their salaries have gone through the roof. But that's another issue. But the thing is, essentially, you were beginning to bring the market in to both education and into the health service. And the Tories supported us with that. They were quite happy. And, what Tony was doing, what Tony Blair's government did, was to run Thatcherism with a human face. He never decried the neoliberal agenda. Now, his predecessor, John Smith, who I had a huge admiration for and who was a man of real substance and quality and who would have been a very, very good Prime Minister, he was a totally different kettle of fish. John Smith was a man of substance. Tony was pretty shallow. And what's more to the point, there were two other things about Tony Blair, and as I say, I give him credit for being one of the greatest communicators I've ever seen in politics. But just because you can sell ice to the Eskimos doesn't mean to say, that you're a man of substance. It just means you're a good salesman, or some would say a good conman. But there were two other things about Tony. Tony was never interested really in domestic politics. Tony Blair was not from the Labour Party, he was not of the Labour Party. Tony Blair was somebody who had his visions for the world, sometimes faith-based, and basically he looked for a political party, the one he could join, that would give him an opportunity to fulfil his own personal ambitions. And it's well documented, and it's been seen on television and such like. Richard Pearl, who was the one of Reagan's closest advisor, he was known as the Prince of Darkness. He said in an interview once, "Oh, Tony's one of us." He's neocon. Tony wanted to dabble in foreign affairs, and he was totally in awe of America and the power of the American president. And in an ideal world, that's what he wanted to be, an American president, because he was infatuated by them. But he was quite happy to hand, basically, domestic policy over to Gordon Brown, because he wanted to dabble in foreign affairs. And where he did dabble in domestic affairs, all of Tony's instincts were market orientated. Now, I'm not saying that the period, the 13 years we were in government, there weren't good things done. There was a reduction in inequality. There were public facilities all over the country, hospitals, Sure Start centres, schools that were rebuilt. However, they, certainly in the case of hospitals and schools, they were built under PFI PPP, which was a funding process, which has just turned out to be a revenue stream for the private sector. And the amount of PFI PPP liabilities there are in 30 years' time, when those contracts come to fruition, the bill is absolutely enormous, because many of those facilities have only got lifespans of 30 years. What's being built now is not like what was Chamberlain built down in the centre of Birmingham, these great Victorian buildings. These were solid buildings, stylish. Maybe they're nowadays they're inefficient and such like, but these are these are these are buildings that were built to last. Schools and hospitals that are being built now under PFI PP bill have a sell-by date on them.
So and built-in obsolescence almost.
Well, yes. if you look at New Queen Elizabeth was built at a cost of something like about 650 million, right? And at the end of its PFI PPP contract, the public will have paid, I think it's 2.3 billion.
A lot of money.
A lot of money, and far more money than it would have cost the Treasury to borrow that money at
historic low rate.
At a historic low rate, and
But is this not about moving?
Well, let me just tell you, yes. just what I'm on about it. The guy at the Treasury was a guy called Stuart Robson, who came up with this wonderful wheeze in the early 90s of PFI PPP. Well, PFI was called at the time. Kenneth Clark was Chancellor, and Kenneth Clark said, yeah, great, lovely. Bring private money into the public services and such like, return. Great idea, I like it. However, says Kenneth Clark, of course that means they take the risk on. Because if they're investing, if they put in a bid to build and finance a new hospital, and the figures aren't right, well, that's down to them. No, the private sector didn't want that. So what happened was, between 1992 and 1997, there were only a very few contracts that went through on PFI. In 1997, Geoffrey Robinson, as Paymaster General, said, okay, we're changing the rules. We still want public-private money to come in, but from now on, the public purse will underwrite those contracts. And of course, everybody piled in because you couldn't miss. You know, you would get this fantastic return. And also, if it all went pear-shaped, there was a commitment the government would pick up the bills. So everybody piled in. Now, the reason why I say that is the guy who thought this wonderful wheeze up at the Treasury, Stuart Robson, what a genius he was. He became Sir Stuart Robson, for his services to the Treasury and such. Then he left the Treasury and he went off to work in banking. And he was a non-executive director of RBS when, in 2008, they hit the buffers and the Nyon brought down the whole financial system. This was this great genius at the Treasury who thought up this wonderful wheeze.
Could I ask you a couple of questions? We've talked briefly about Tony Blair and his prime ministership, also the Labour government of 97 to 2010 and some of the work that he's done. You can look back over a long history of involvement in the Labour Party, and in fact you said you joined the Labour Party in 1965, so
right.
On my maths that takes us to a good 50 years, which is in itself a notable achievement. Now, you talked about previous Prime Ministers, and so if we start from, say, 1965 onwards in your political involvement, we of course had Harold Wilson winning famously in 64,
Yep.
going on to 1970, winning another term in 1966. We then had him coming back, the comeback kid in the...
he won 4 elections out of 5.
What did you think of him as a Prime Minister and a Labour Party man?
Harold Wilson was very much a Labour Party man, although in his younger days he had been a Liberal. But he was a very young cabinet minister in the Attlee government, and
31, I think.
Yeah. 31 years of age. I personally quite liked Harold Wilson. When he was elected, he was hugely popular. His popularity began to wane, particularly over the devaluation back in 1967. But he still retained a lot of support in the country, and he came across as, you know, very very much a man's man with his pipe and his Gannock's Mac and such like, and he didn't have many airs and graces about him, and also he was not in awe of the Americans. He was under huge pressure from President Johnson to commit even a token force of British towards the Vietnam War, and he didn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And the 64, 70 Labour governments, they had some substantial achievements. For example, the Open University, which was set up during that time, has been a fantastic success, which is still going. You know, it's still one of the public facilities that hasn't been sold off yet by the Thatcher Revolution. He had the common touch. He also had big beasts in the jungle in that cabinet. I mean, when Wilson formed his cabinet in 1964, there were big people. You know, people like, for example, Roy Jenkins, Tony Crosland, Jim Callaghan, Barbara Castle, Anthony Crosland, Dick Crossman, Ted Short. I mean, these were big figures in the Labour movement, many of whom had done real jobs in the real world before they became politicians. You know, not special advisors, you know, who had grown up in the Westminster bubble. So there was a breadth of ability and backgrounds, and he managed them quite well. So I was quite impressed by Harold Wilson's premiership. Jim Callaghan, who followed on, had a much more difficult time because of the economic circumstances of the country, and he made a very bad judgment in 1978 in not calling an election then, but holding off. And then we had the trade union madness in 1979 with the winter of discontent, rubbish piled in the streets, bodies unburied, and that sadly ushered in the Thatcherite revolution.
Yeah, interesting that a figure like Foote then takes over later. I mean, it's an interesting.
Well, Michael Foote during the Wilson.
He was reluctant to become the become the Secretary of State for Employment himself.
Michael Foote was very much a backbencher during the first Wilson government, but he came into the second Wilson government and he became a very prominent figure under Callaghan, and a very successful Secretary of State and a well-respected figure. But once again, in that Callaghan government, you have big people, big beasts in the jungle. People like Healy, for example, a huge personality in himself.
And a man who had, dare one say it, a hinterland, a depth, an intellectual, a man who was interested in photography, poetry.
Absolutely right. And also
brilliant war record.
Exactly, and also a background. I mean, his war record, as a beachmaster, on D-Day. These were people who had real substance and a whole breadth of backgrounds that they came from. For example, in the Wilson government of 64, they actually contrived a by-election down in Nuneaton in order to bring in the General Secretary of Transport and General Workers Union, Frank Cousins, into Parliament and into the Cabinet. These were big people in their own right, and sadly, one of the problems in this Labour Party election that's going on at the moment is that a lot of people feel very underwhelmed by the candidates. Indeed, I was asked. It's not something I would say publicly, but my description was, three political pygmies and John the Baptist, which may be a bit unfair, but I think quite a few people would say, yeah, actually, I understand what you're saying. And one of the problems is because the three candidates, other than Corbyn, and even Corbyn came up essentially, although he did have some time in, he worked in Jamaica for voluntary service overseas, but then he went to work for a trade union, so his background was trade union before he came into politics. In the case of the other three, they essentially, their career path has been school, university, think tank, MP's office, ministerial office, MP, minister. I mean, people talk about the Westminster bubble. Well, unfortunately for them, they represent the Westminster bubble. There is nobody you can really say has had a career or a life outside of politics.
I remember my father saying that he was applying for a job in his 50s when he was unemployed, and he said, "Steve, I've gone for this job," he says, "and they want somebody who's got 30 years experience but is 25 years old."
Yeah.
And there is a sense in which there isn't that hinterland of background, as you said, a grounded background perhaps. You spoke, I think, in 1992, you talked, in replying to the autumn statement, you talked about unemployment in your own constituency, the year you were elected.
Yeah.
And you said that you'd been unemployed very briefly.
But
many people on the other side of the benches had never been in that position.
I was between. I had a period unemployed, and it's certainly a salutary experience to to go down to the job centre and join in it. Yeah, and the Tory, by and large, they've never had that sort of experience. But
I'm interested in.
I didn't have the experience, however, the funny experience of a colleague of mine. I'm just trying to think what his name was. Anyway, in the dying days of the Callaghan government, he was a minister in the Foreign Office, and he lost his seat. He was a Birmingham MP from one of the constituencies around. His name escapes me for a minute. Anyway, he lost his seat, and I remember him telling myself and John Speller the story of going along to the job centre afterwards and signing on. They said, "Well, what was your, you've lost your job, okay. So what were you?" Well, I was Parliamentary Under Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and that. And the guy behind there said, "Yeah, I think I better get my boss."
Yes, indeed. Well, of course, politics is that very, very hard game.
Yeah.
Because you can lose your seat, you can be a minister as you've just described, or in
yeah.
the government, you can be have the
yeah.
car,
Yeah.
the man outside brings your bag, carries your whatever,
Yeah,
brings
that's right,
you
yeah.
all the accoutrements of power, and then it can go.
Overnight.
Which brings me to your own political life, if you like. I mean, you first came to Birmingham, as you said, to assist
Early
Dennis
80s,
Howell
yeah.
in his seat, but also as a political officer. Not exclusively, but to lend your political nous to the numbers game, for which you're well known. You then stood in '83 in Yardley. You lost that election, and
I got swing to me. I was one of the 5 MPs, one of the 5 Labour candidates in the country where there was actually a swing to Labour. Probably had more to do with the fact my wife produced a baby on the day of election. There's a picture over there. So it was all over the front page of the Birmingham Mail in the evening, so I probably got a bit of the sympathy vote. But that was a good experience.
Yeah.
That was, yeah.
So tell me, had you before then sought quite a number of nominations, or was Yardley top of your list, or did that come to you via Dennis Healy Dennis Howell rather, saying to you, "Come along and
No, I'll tell you exactly how it came about. There was I've been to a couple of selections and such like without success. But I was actually at a meeting at the House of Commons with John Golding and John Speller, doing some, plotting work or whatever it was, and the subject of the guy who had been selected down in Yardley, who was a POEU, John Golding's union, a POEU nominee, and he'd been selected, but then he'd been deselected. He'd been deselected because he got into some personal indiscretion which had upset the controlling group in Yardley, who had put pressure on him to resign. And the conversation was something like, well, so-and-so, has stood down, says John, that's left us in a bit of a quandary now as to what to do. Do we nominate somebody else or that? Got any suggestions? And John Speller was running in Northfield anyway. So, I said, well, if nobody else, I don't mind doing it. And, the rest is history. That's what happened. The people down in Yardley were really good, and they were good operators. People like the Gracies, Judy and John Gracie, lovely people. They were very good supporters down there and very good operators. And then you had the O'Tooles, because they were also good supporters and again very good operators, because essentially Yardley was a different constituency at the time. There was a very big Catholic influence in the Yardley constituency, and quite a few of the members were practicing Catholics. That helped me because my main contestant was somebody called Maureen Calhoun, who had been the MP in Northampton, who was a renowned lesbian, which of course, nowadays one wouldn't think any more about it, but at that time in '83, that still raised some opinions, let's say, amongst people. But anyway, it worked out all right, and it was actually a very enjoyable campaign, apart from the fact that in 1983 Labour got slaughtered.
Absolutely. Of course, you then presumably look for another seat. You get a taste of it. You think elsewhere. You presumably don't. You obviously don't get selected because you don't stand anywhere else, as far as I know. Or did you stand somewhere else?
No, I didn't stand anywhere else. And I didn't actively look. I was offered to fight Yardley again in 1987, but I knew that Dennis Howe had it in mind to retire, and I knew that I would be reasonably well placed to succeed him. I would have his support, plus the fact I had built up connections with a number of people in the constituency. So I really decided, no, I'll wait for Dennis to retire rather than go for Yardley again, and in any event, they're next door to each other.
Yeah, that kind of brings us to, if you like, that selection of 92, or or the selection period beforehand, which is written about graphically by somebody who is not probably your best fan, and not to be invited, no doubt, doesn't have a Christmas card list with you, and that of course is Andy McSmith, writing in his book Faces of Labour, when he writes that chapter on Claire Short, somebody else who was probably not necessarily in your camp as a or Mr. Golding's, nor perhaps Mr. Speller's camp.
No,
someone who was.
No, you're absolutely right. But if I might cut across you, what's quite interesting is, well, Claire Short was still an MP, and she wasn't holding any office. Now I have to think now. It was after she left the Blair government. I remember going up in the escalator with her one day, and we got into conversation, quite amicable conversation, and she made the comment, Roger, isn't it strange that you and I can be having this conversation now and basically agreeing on an issue, whereas we could never agree on anything before. And I said, well, actually, I haven't changed my views. What's changed is the centre of gravity in the Labour Party has gone sailing way past me. So whereas I would have been classified as being on the right, I haven't moved, and yet some people would now say, oh, well, you're on the left. Well, I haven't changed and I haven't moved, but the centre of gravity in the Labour Party has moved.
Right. Okay.
And it moved under Blair, essentially.
Right. So let us take us back to the selection period of time. There are four candidates. There's the noted figure of Mohammed Afzal. There is, of course, at that time, the wife of Sir Albert Bohr.
Yes, she was the. She was the wife of Albert. And
subsequently to have an acrimonious divorce, I believe.
And
then Stuart Stacey. Well, according, and I'll give you the right of rebuttal because I've not seen anything that you've put in writing about it, though you may or may not have done, and if I haven't seen it, my researches are limited. But McSmith makes some serious allegations in that book about the fixing. He uses the word fixing, I think, of that vote and that selection, and it gets so toxic that we have the election results being locked up in a solicitor's office. We have learned friends running around the place, no doubt incurring further expenses for all parties. you potentially said to be involved in some sort of action, winning some legal action, and then it being pursued. There being factionalism within the Asian community. Everybody had thought Mohammed Afzal was a shoo-in. At least that's the way it looked from some commentators. But again, I come back to John Golding's comments about you, the accolades, the man who does the numbers. And you did the numbers and operated, if you like, the Labour Party machine, read the rule book extremely well, knew your way around these things, and came out a success in that. Did you, when you went into that election, think it would be so difficult and so troubling? And what do you say about Andy McSmith's comments in his book?
I didn't think it would be as bloody as it got by any manner of means. But it was part of a wider picture. You see, what you have to understand at the time is that Claire Short was very opposed to me, as was Newby, Rodney Bickerstaff, the General Secretary, and Tom Sawyer, who I crossed swords with over the work I did for the moderate unions, because they were on the other side. But Claire Short was under threat of being deselected, with the electricians' union exercising their muscle in favour of a Sikh guy, Marwar, in her constituency. And she was under severe threat of being deselected. And therefore you had this strange situation where you had Neil Kinnock, who was leader, who was very thankful to myself for the work I'd done in giving him an NEC which was supportive of him. But also one of his shadow cabinet members, Claire Short, in an almost adjoining constituency, who was under threat, and it became a bigger picture. Now, Mohammed Afzal was very close to Claire Short. Mohammed Afzal was never a shoo-in by any manner of means, because the one thing within the Asian community is that if you put half a dozen people in the same room, you've got at least 5 factions, and you know he had strong supporters in the community and people who hated him, Mohammed Afzal, because they knew the way he operated. The one thing I did do and spent an enormous amount of time doing, I actually spent time going around to see people. I spent, many hours up until midnight visiting people. That paid a lot of dividends, because some of my best supporters, people like Bashir Khan, who sadly is dead now, who lived down in Ralph Road, he would often accompany me, and that nailed down a lot of support. Basically, I had the right and centrist white support anyway, and Afro-Caribbean support. But amongst the Muslim community, that paid huge dividends, and it's paid dividends subsequently in terms of the amount of time I spent with the Muslim community. But yeah, it did get very bloody, very dirty. I mean, it was also quite funny. Halfway through the selection conference, when it actually took place, my opponents tried one last tactic to try and get the thing called off. It was on Sunday afternoon. They started getting up to leave the room, and Fraser Kemp, who was regional secretary, who was chairing the meeting, suddenly stood up And I'd done my speech. I think it was Najma Hafiz who was speaking. They suddenly started getting up. Fraser Kemp stood up and said, "Hang on a minute, you can't leave. Anybody who leaves this meeting is debarred. You can't vote." And they said, "It's prayer time, isn't it?" And Fraser said, "Well, I'm sorry, you can't leave the meeting. You can't leave the meeting." And old Bashir Khan, bless his heart, so I'm told, rushed up to the table to Fraser and said, "Fraser, for God's sake, let them pray here. Roger's all right. He's got the numbers. Just don't let him out of the room. Just let him pray here." So Fraser Kemp said, "All right, we'll take 10 minutes and you can pray in the room." So they were all down on bloody prayer mats. So it's
you had God on your side as well on that day.
It had funny sides to it anyway.
So did that election, in the sense that you were fighting two councillors, well, they were all councillors at that time, I think they were, all three were councillors, Mohammed Afzal,
Yeah.
Stuart Story, and of course Hajar. How did
Stuart only had a small number of votes.
Yes. Well, they only pulled 10 or 15 votes between the two of them, didn't they?
He only had a very small number of votes. Najma Hafiz, she wasn't able to pull very many votes in the Muslim community for the simple reason, and you've got to remember the time when it was, there was a huge misogynist tendency, and therefore the idea of voting for a woman, particularly a woman from a rather posh type background within the Muslim community, no, they weren't terribly interested. What they wanted was a member of parliament who was going to be like Dennis Howe, and preferably better, who would look after them, deal with their cases, be even-handed, not stitch them up, not take money from them, and that they felt comfortable with. That's what they wanted.
And would you say that's what they got?
Yeah, I would say that's what they got, yeah.
Yeah. And continuing after that, the bloody 90s, that constituency then, of course, changed.
Yeah.
Another
one in Spark Hill.
Yeah. And of course, there were difficulties there as well.
True.
With Lord Hattersley, who had a personal grievance, didn't he, in respect of you? I mean, in the book, John Golding talks about you and John Golding going to see him to what he calls putting the black spot on him, telling him that basically he wasn't going to be.
He couldn't be Kinnock.
Yes.
Yeah. And he exploded.
He exploded. John Golding tells it. He told him the facts of life, and then he waited for you to pull out your piece of paper or something like that, where you actually showed him the numbers.
Yeah.
This is the numbers, Roy.
Yeah, and he said
he didn't
so
forgive.
So the bloody choice is I've got to be deputy to the Welsh windbag, or I can go off and work for the Observer as deputy editor of the Observer at 40 grand a year.
Yes, indeed.
Well,
he decided to stay on as a Labour MP until 1997.
He did.
When you then got selected.
Yeah, well,
of course, he'd had his own problems in terms of his.
He'd had his own problems, but the problem was he was betwixt or between as to whether to. What he sort of had in mind was, well, if I can be re-elected in 1997, a new incoming Labour government, and by then, after Black Wednesday and the tragic death of John Smith, Blair had taken over. But after Black Wednesday, which happened in 1992 when Britain was chucked out of the ERM, it was odds on the Tories were going to lose the next election. Everything was going against them. Major was in terrible problems with his backbenchers over Maastricht. Labour was looking credible again. They would have won under John Smith when Tony Blair came in. Once again, as part of his, brilliant sales pitch, and that he basically anaesthetised anybody who could have voted against the Labour Party, who could have had any reason. So come 1997, unless you were sort of retired Rear Admiral living in Tunbridge Wells, anybody else in the country had no problem about voting Labour. So it was odds on Labour was going to win, and Hattersley had this idea that somehow if he was still there, a new incoming Labour government would need, somebody who knew the ropes and all that, who could sort of have a swan song as for a few years as leader of the House of Commons or something like that. That's what he thought. But of course, when they merged the two constituencies, it was him and me, and he chose not to fight me, and he
Frick?
He chose not to fight me, and he said he was not going to stand again. Then I ended up with the new constituency. Of course, you had Moseley, which was a traditional left ward. I'd lost Nechel's ward, which was a very strong bastion of mine. I'd lost Aston, and I got Small East Sparkbrook, and I got Acots Green Moseley. That's right, Acots Green Moseley, Sparkbrook, and Springfield. And I virtually had to do the same thing again because the big areas had moved away. So, I virtually had to go door knocking again and sit down, drink lots of cups of coffee with people in Springfield and Sparkhill as it was, and Sparkbrook.
Tell me, you see, Golding again talks about you being fairly unflappable, calm. Whereas Speller would get excited, want to do certain things. Golding would get excited, and you would do what you're doing almost now, which he describes. He'd give that famous Roger Godsiff slight move of the lips, a slight smile, sardonic or whatever he describes it as, and just keep your own counsel, wait, talk. Is that what you think a lot of the newer intake of politicians don't do? They're not good people. They're not good, connectors with people. Is that one of your gifts as a politician, do you think?
Well, I would like to think so. I'd like to think that I engage quite well with people. I think a lot of people, new intake in Parliament, are decent people. I think quite a few of them are a bit green. And maybe, you need to have been around the houses a bit to become a bit more worldly about these things, and also to know how to take the knocks, as well as enjoy the good times. So I don't become too flappable. You're absolutely right, because I've when you're standing there waiting for the result of the Dennis Healey contest, with people sort of cracking up around you, saying, he's lost. This is the end of the Labour Party. Ben's, going to be deputy leader. Oh my God, where do we go? And there was a guy, Giles Radici, who was a member of Parliament. Yes. He's a member of the House of Lords now. And he was one of them, standing right next to me, saying, we've had it, yeah. And I was standing there saying, well, my calculations are he's won, only just, but he's won. And I mean, when you're sort of on the knife edge like that, it tends to teach you to be, not to get too excitable one way or the other,
And also, you've been in some very tight competitions in terms of getting people on slates and the past and working compromises and. I mean, to use that boring phrase, politics is the art of the possible. Is it?
Well,
is that a mantra that you would sing? I know it was a Tory mantra, from Rab Butler. But
you have to make compromises. You have to make compromises in life, don't you? You can't have everything your own way. You have to make it in your personal life, your personal relationship. You can't go around, just saying, well, we're doing it this way, and that, because people won't support you. It's as simple as that. So you've got to be prepared to make compromises. I think in politics, the reason why would like to think people have a reasonable respect for me is I do what I say, I'll fight my corner, and I don't flip flop one way or the other. I'll think about it, make a decision, and I'm not saying that I won't ever change it. Somebody can give me a good reason for it, but I don't just go one way or the other, and I don't. I don't see one thing to some people, and another thing to other people. I tell them as I see it. People make up their own mind.
Going back to McSmith, he describes you as an isolated figure in Parliament at some particular time. Is that a characteristic that you think was true? I mean, some people would not say isolated, but maybe not clubbable.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, I don't go around. I'm all in favour of having a drink. And I'm quite happy to go into the bar at the House of Commons, have a drink there, go on the terrace. But I'm not a frequenter. If I have a reason to go there because I have a guest or I've arranged to meet somebody, then I'll go. But otherwise, I spend time in my office and I work there. I'm not a clubbable person, no, like that. John Speller, on the other hand, he is. John's always in the tea room and.
Your friendships, it intrigues me. You and Speller.
Yeah, but he goes back to 1965.
Yeah.
He was brought up in Bromley, which was the next borough to mine. He was a member of the South Lewisham Young Socialists, as I was. I was chairman of it.
Because one of the things that strikes me about is building up relationships, and we talked about.
He's one of the few people. I mean, I would say, if you said to me, how many people would I trust my life on in politics, and the answer would be certainly not more than 5 people, and 2 of them would have been John Golding and Speller.
Yeah,
that was a relationship I have.
Yes, it's very interesting that
they're the sort of people who
they said they were going to do something.
If I was up against a brick wall, with my back to the wall, and I needed to make a phone call to sort of, phone a friend to summon them, I know I could have phoned either of those, and they wouldn't have said why. They would have said where.
Yes. Well, that's it. That is interesting. So, tell me, you just briefly, you've moved into a new constituency. It's a different constituency.
Yeah.
Ethnicity is somewhat different, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
We then move into the 2000s, and we've got you again fighting elections. As I think at one point you were the only non-Asian candidate in the. There was huge people against you in the from other parties, from the Liberals, the Respect, and various other people building up. How?
Well, in one of the selections, I had 13 competitors.
Yes, and
I think 10 of those got no votes.
Goodness.
Yeah, it was quite funny actually. It was.
And going through all these years, then there's the, again we get the 2010, and there's then a change again. You have a new constituency, new boundaries. We're obviously fixed parliaments now, so we've got 220. By that time, you'll be nearly 74. Going to continue? Or is it something that you don't know? You haven't made up your mind?
I enjoy the job I do, and I think I would like to think I'm quite good at it, and I try and do my best. But at the end of the day, I'm only here because the party members will support me for being the candidate again, and the people will vote for me.
You've got an overwhelming vote at the last election. Though. That was old style weighing the votes. Almost. You trounced everybody else. There's no other way of putting it. Is there?
One appreciates that level of support, and one would like to think that was to some extent a reflection of the service I tried to give on behalf of my constituents. I enjoy, and I count it as a very privileged position to be able to do it. You see, there's not many positions, quite frankly, where I can say something and have a reasonable belief that a fair number of people will hear it, whether it be in Parliament or whether it be on the radio. Because I've got MP after my name, if I feel strongly about a subject, I can, do something about it. I can make a noise about it. Whereas a lot of people, it used to be they vented their opinions, down at the pub or working men's club and that. But nowadays they're often be quite frustrated. They can't have their say. Well, I'm in a privileged position where I can, and because I have MP after my name. By and large, I can get a hearing for it.
Comes with a price, though, doesn't it? I mean, there are many, many stories of MPs' relationships being under strain, and living away from home for a lot of people in London, having their family home. Your family home is in London, and this is your constituency office. So from that point, home. Yeah. But the reality is that. A larger proportion of your time is still in Birmingham.
You can't avoid it.
Yeah. Some do avoid it, don't they?
Well, with great difficulty. But I mean, you have to have two lives, unless you're lucky enough to have a constituency within sort of 30 miles of London where you can commute on a daily basis.
Yes.
You are going to have two sorts of lives, so you have to compartmentalise, and you do 3 days, 4 days in London, 3 days in Birmingham, vice versa. But you can do it if you can organise it, and I would like to think that I've organised it now, both in terms of allocation of my time and having the right staff and that, whereby I can. It almost functions on autopilot. I get a huge amount of correspondence that comes into my office since we're here, and I have very good staff who assist me in processing it and dealing with it, and getting many occasions the right result from it. I was told very early on when I was selected. In 1991, I was told by Charles Clark, who worked for Neil Kinnock and who I knew well and had dealings with, in terms of the work that I was doing for the unions. And Charles said, well, so what you going to do? And I said, well, I'll have a house in the constituency. I've got my place in London. And he said, look, take my advice, Roger. You should have your family in London. You should not have your family in the constituency and you be in London. He said because Neil Kinnock did that, and he had his family down in Wales, and he was obviously spending the vast majority of his time in London. He said, no, I'm wrecked his marriage, so don't do it. that was what he said to me, and I think it was good advice, and it was advice that I'd follow. And I think the problem tends to occur when you do have your family apart from you. And whereas I have to be in London because the House of Parliament, therefore when my children were growing up, it was a good thing they were in London.
Absolutely. So the role of MP, that's always intrigued me because, of course, I mean, years and years ago, I mean, Golding again makes a comment about, say, somebody like Roy Jenkins. I mean, Roy Jenkins was an old-fashioned MP, as far as one can gather. I mean, he very much treated the constituency.
Very seldom turned up.
Yeah, he seldom turned up, and he treated other MPs, as Golding makes a comment about him being arrogant and all the rest of it. You've got to make links with people. You've also got to keep your own line. But the role of MP has changed fundamentally, hasn't it? Even in the time that you've been elected. I say even in the time. I mean, it is a long time, 20-odd years. But you must have seen a change from, say, 92 to now, and what's happening and what people demand of their MP.
The demand on MPs gets greater and greater all the time. And I personally don't complain about that. But whereas, for example, I was told the story, or I think I was told the story of the MP for Derbyshire, something. He was a miner, Tom Swain.
Oh yes, North East Derbyshire.
Yeah, North East Derbyshire.
Yeah. And they weighed the votes for him in that.
Yeah, they weighed the votes for him, but I was told that Tom Swain never answered letters. You know, people wrote to him, he never answered them.
No.
Now, he would, be down the miners' club and such like, having a drink, but he wouldn't answer letters. He didn't do that. And what's more to the point, when I first went into Parliament, the facilities for MPs were far less than they are now. But even then, they were better than they were previously, where people didn't have full-time staff, didn't have offices. Now,
which is why wives got dragged in to be secretaries and various other things. That's the historic background to that.
And now I have a big office in Parliament, a very big office. I have excellent staff, 2 staff there. I have Margaret here working from here. I have Gorba, and I have Simon here, and I have Derek who does odds and sods. And why do I need that size staff? For the simple reason, demands increase all the time. And one of the big changes has been that with new methods of communications, people can contact their MPs by email and such like, using modern technology. In the past, a lot of people, felt a bit scared about writing to their MPs. More and more nowadays, you get electronic communications, but then you also get communications that are sent to many other MPs. You can't always decipher whether it's come to you or to Uncle Tom Cobley, whereas in the past, if you had a nutter, the nutter had to write his own personalised green ink letter to you. Now he can just type in something and send it halfway around the world to all and sundry. And also because particularly with the Asian community, the Muslim community, there's a perception that MPs can fix just about anything. That case I was with just now was a case in point, an immigration case, and that comes from their experience of the Indian subcontinent, particularly Pakistan, which is corrupt. That if you go and see the MP can get your brother out of jail, or get your worst enemy put in jail, or this or that, etc., etc., etc. And there's a big perception that the MP can do something, and then so far as other people are concerned, dealing with benefits, tax credits and such like, people just don't know how to work their way around the system, so go to your MP. So for a whole variety of reasons, the amount of work coming into MPs is much more than it used to be, irrespective of all the plethora of campaigns that you have nowadays on single issue things, from animal welfare through to abortion, through to assisted dying, all this sort of thing. You'll get lots and lots of correspondence and lots of people who want to engage with you, and that's good, that's rightly so, but it does mean you've got to have the resources to deal with it, and you've got to also be prepared to, particularly with a constituency like this, where in places like Moseley and to a slightly lesser extent in Hall Green, but particularly in Moseley, people expect you to, not just send back short, sharp template replies. They want, if you're going to do something, they want to explain it. And I don't have any problem with that, but it does mean that you have to personalise it, and people appreciate it. And it's
indeed,
and it's votes in the bank for you in due course, but it also means it takes time.
This is the equivalent of having a cup of tea at midnight in places.
Right,
so that the new electronic media has changed all of that way of dealing with things.
Yeah.
But also, one of the things that really does strike me about your job is that you've got to have the hide of a rhinoceros, haven't you? Because you've been attacked, vilified. People have made personal things about you. I mean, your children's education, some suggestion that you should live in the constituency, some of your own campaigns, even people within your own constituency who you might have thought of as colleagues and supporters. And I just wonder, doesn't that change you psychologically as an individual, having that, thinking, where is it? What is in it for this individual? Where are they coming from? What is the game plan? It's a bit like having to play chess, sort of in a multi-dimensional sort of form. It would strike to me, and also have the local press maybe just have a letter published attacking you, and I don't hear many direct rebuttals from you. You kind of, I get the feeling, sit back and just let it sometimes sort of wash over you, and and then not engage in the personal too much. Though you have had the odd occasion when you've.
But I don't. Whether I do radio interviews, television interviews, I never attack my colleagues. I'll argue the issue, but for example, over the welfare bill, I did a radio interview. WM, and they said, well, we had Steve McCabe on this morning, and he took a contribution. I said, well, look, I don't comment on what any of my parliamentary colleagues do. I only comment on what I do. And by and large, that people will accept that because they can't do anything else. I'm not going to comment on it. But in terms of personal attack,
you're a noted advocate of education being kept in local authorities, there being more local authority control. You're against free schools and academies. You're on record of having voted on that, and yet at some point your children go to a private school. Now, I don't think it's my business to know that, and I don't want to know. I've just used that as an example of somewhere which must have been, you might have wanted to actually reply, but chose not to, and just said that's not something. The personal I'm not getting involved in. The political you can attack me on, but the others. But there must be a temptation sometimes to want to. Your voting record you've been attacked on, for instance, and yet you spend time in the constituency, which means therefore you still can't be in the House of Commons voting when you know you're going to be losing the vote in any event. So how you do that balance, that's what I mean.
Okay. Well, I mean, so far as personal choices one makes in one's individual life, you make the choices, and no, I don't go in for, justifying a personal decision that I took because I don't feel inclined to do it. Or at least myself and my wife took, so I never feel inclined to do it. In any event, it's water under the bridge. But in terms of, for example, voting in the House of Commons, you always get that comes up at election time. You've only voted, you've only spoken in so many debates and such like. But once again, I don't come back on it because I know how the system works. You see, they have these lists, How often has your MP spoken in the House of Commons? Well, if you look at it, you will see that, for example, Lindsay Hoyle has spoken, 300 occasions during the last week. But he hasn't spoken at all. What happens is, because he's Deputy Speaker, right, every time he calls Mr. Jones, that's one. Order, that's two. You can, as soon as you utter something, if, for example, you get up or somebody's speaking and say, "Will you give way?" That counts as one. No. Will you give way? That counts as two. Will you give? It's got nothing to do with the number of speeches you make. It's the number of times you actually open your mouth in the House of Commons, and that clocks up as one, two. That is the way it works. Because, as I say, the classic example is, look at the number of times Lindsay Hoyle is classified as having spoken. Well, he doesn't speak at all because he's Deputy Speaker. But he does talk because he calls people. And every time he calls somebody, that's one. Calls somebody else, that's two. Calls somebody, order, that's three. That's four. And that's the way it works. So, why try and explain that away? I mean, it's a pointless exercise, to be perfectly honest. Totally pointless exercise. People judge me.
There is a voting record, which is somewhat different.
Oh yeah, the voting record. You're right, but I mean, once again, in terms of voting records, there are occasions when I vote with my party. There are occasions I vote against. There are occasions where I don't vote.
And you don't vote because the merit of the argument, you haven't been convinced of it one way or another, or you're just unsure.
No, it's because I'm not convinced one way or the other.
Yes.
And on other things, there are votes which are not important. They're not earth shattering.
Looking at what is recorded as your special interests, if you like. I mean, would it be easy to characterise it as this, that you're against, for instance, personal data being kept by the government, which doesn't need to do so? I mean, that would strike me as being a sort of a libertarian view, and maybe characteristic of somebody of your political background, thinking, why does the state need to have that information? It shouldn't have that. Mm-hmm. You're on record as being against Trident.
Yep.
You're against the extension
in favour of NATO.
Yes, a considerable difference, I agree, and a nuance which perhaps is lost again, you would say, in how people would, they would say against Trident and then say that ticks 5 or 6 other boxes.
Yeah, well,
but you'd go and say actually Trident is what I've voted against, but NATO, I believe, should be strong.
Yeah.
Military covenant you're a supporter of, which many people might find strange.
Yeah, and I'm also in favour of spending 2% of our GDP on the armed services, because I believe our troops are entitled to have proper body armour and equipment when they're sent into war zones. It's not their choice. We the politicians send them there, And I don't like seeing them come back minus their arms and legs through lack of decent equipment. So I'm in favour of spending 2% of GDP on defence spending.
Again, there are subtleties which are somewhat lost in the mists of the way it's reported.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is, well, that's the danger of box ticking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if they want to find out, all they have to do is go on to the last debate there was on Trident, and they will see me arguing against it, but saying I'm strongly in favour of NATO.
Mm. Against hunting with dogs. We move on to one that's always interesting: same-sex marriage. You appear to have voted some ways.
I voted against redefining marriage.
Yes,
I made it absolutely clear.
Right.
And I made it absolutely clear the reasons why, and I put it in writing.
Right. Some people said cynically that was a vote catcher in terms of your constituency. Do you rebut that as a slur upon your independence as an MP and someone who's always been willing to say what he wants?
Yeah, it wasn't a vote catcher in general terms in Moseley. It most certainly wasn't, because by the very nature of the area, you would have a sizable gay community. You would have a sizable community who would be probably majority support the concept of gay marriage. On the other hand, if you move next door into Hall Green, you would tend to find, particularly amongst older generations, quite a lot of people who felt very uncomfortable about the idea of redefining marriage, and who were not opposed to civil partnerships, were not opposed to the idea of two people of the same sex having a relationship, but felt, well, hang on a minute, me and my husband were married for 40 years, and now it seems that the institution that we bought into is now being changed, and they felt uncomfortable about it, and I respected that. So on balance, plus the fact, I had a lot of letters from Stonewall, which was the umbrella organisation for gay people, thanking me for my support for civil partnerships and such like, and saying, look, we are not seeking to undermine marriage. We do not want same-sex. We do not want same-sex marriage, etc. We're very happy with civil partnership. Then they go and change their mind because they have a row. Then they turn around to MPs and say, "Oh, we changed our mind. Will you please turn around now and change your vote?" Well, the answer is no. You have to make a judgment, and within the context of my constituency, the idea I did it for votes, I wouldn't rebut the issue, but it's silly because, as you said yourself earlier, I did get a rather large majority last time.
I wanted to ask you just two further things, really. One about your relationships with local government and figures in local government in Birmingham, because clearly the MP has got to have a fairly good relationship with people, because some of the things that you can do cross over from what the local councillors can do. Mm-hmm. Now, I know for a fact that, at least I like to think, you have a good relationship with all of the Hall Green councillors. Very lucky to have had 3 from nowhere, 0 to 3, which was great news for Hall Green. Now we've had a re-election of Councillor Burden as well, so that's another success. And the vote held up very well in terms of locally and also in your own election. What do you see as the relationship between you as the MP and those local councillors, and also your relationship with, say, Sir Albert Bohr and people like that, who are obviously at a different level within the council, but can have an effect on things? Where do you see that?
My relationship with the local councillors, I like to think, is a very good one. I keep them informed of any issues that come across my desk, or any national issues which I think can be helpful to them in the work they do. For example, what the police are doing over quad bikes, which is an irritation throughout many parts of the constituency. But the police come to me, after I took the issue up with them, and they explained exactly what they're doing and such like. So that's just an example. I tell the councillors, I send the information to the councillors to keep them up to speed on it and such like. There are issues, there are local issues where I will fight with them for something or against something. There will be some local issues sometimes where we will be on different sides. But they have a job to do as a councillor, I have a job to do as an MP, and if that means that on certain issues we are on a different side, and it doesn't happen very often, but there will be the occasional one, then so be it. I respect them and I hope they respect me. I like to think I have a good relationship with all the councillors. Now, one of the problems there is, and it's not a problem that occurs in Hall Green because, as you say, you've got 3 good councillors there, but there has been the case over the time I've been an MP where I've had councillors sometime who quite frankly aren't up to the job or only want to be a councillor because they've got the prefix of being a councillor and a nice little 18 grand to go with it. And then, to be perfectly honest, I expect people to bring me local problems, which is what they do. I get far less local problems in an area like Hall Green because all 3 councillors, or one of the 3 councillors, will, invariably take up the issue, and I won't need people to come to me and say, look, I went to the council and I didn't get any response from them. But I've had that in the past in certain areas, and even within the constituency, there's 1 or 2 that will still fall in that category. But that doesn't bother me. So far as the council down at the city hall are concerned, I don't have a good relationship with Albert Bohr because Albert Bohr is a control freak, and he believes the role of MPs is to go out and get what he wants in for Birmingham. So if he's calling for more money for Birmingham, job of the MPs is to go and demand more money. If he's calling for this, then the role of the MP is to do his bidding. And
There are frustrated on the basis that he never became an MP himself?
Well, I don't know, Albert. He's just a control freak. He did at one time want to become an MP, but he is a control freak. It's not in his nature, and I'm not being ultra critical of him. It's in his DNA. He can't do anything about it. You take somebody like Dick Knowles, who I have much more of a closer relationship with, and Dick was much more inclusive. I mean, Dick would come and have meetings with the MPs down in London, and you could turn around and say to him, look, Dick, we have got a problem with one of your policies, and the problem is this: you are doing this, and we are getting people coming to us saying so and so, and quite frankly, we think they're right and you're wrong, and Dick, you've got to go away and talk to your colleagues and do something about this and change that, because this is doing you no good and it's not doing us. Dick could take that and he'd listen to it. He might turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, now hear my side of it. But he'd be prepared to have give and take, right? The case of Albert...
He came from a different background.
Well, I know he came from a different...
An organiser in trade unions.
Yeah, I know that. So, I know that. I know he was different personality. It was in his nature to be prepared to listen. And he was prepared to listen, and particularly when he was dealing with people who were on his wavelength, and I, for example, was, whereas Claire Short never was, because they were on different sides of the political spectrum. But you could do business with him. And, I felt very comfortable. With Albert, it's a waste of time. It's like talking to a brick wall. Because if you go and do that with Albert, you will get half an hour of his problems. So if you would say, look, Albert,
So he's been a disaster for the Labour Party?
Well,
in the last, I mean, he's been in control since 1999.
I think there needs to be a change in the leadership of Birmingham City Council, because I think
to John Clancy?
Well, I think John Clancy is a capable person. I'm not going to say who it should be, but what I think is that Albert has outlived his time. And one of the problems is I could never fault Albert in the same way as I can't fault Tony Blair with his communication skills. You know, I said to you at the beginning, Reagan, Clinton and Blair, you know, they're the best communicators I've known in politics. What they're communicating is a different ballgame. What they're selling is a different ballgame. But in terms of being able to engage the best, in the context of Albert, you can't fault Albert for the time he puts in. He puts in 23 hours, 59 minutes, 59 seconds of every day into Birmingham. But the problem is, if you do that, you can't see the wood for the trees. And he ends up not just managing policy, but managing the minutiae of the council. You know, not just the big decision, everything. You know, he runs everything. And that's one of the reasons why Birmingham, in my experience, in terms of the quality of councillors overall in Birmingham, and I've always said this, I served 19 years on Lewisham Council and there were 60 members of Lewisham Council, overwhelmingly Labour. But the quality of people on there overall was far higher than it was in Birmingham. You know, in terms of their abilities, in terms of their input, was far higher than in Birmingham. Now, that's not to say they're all a bunch of duds in Birmingham, because they're not. There are good people. But one of the reasons why they tend to come and go is because that it's not an inclusive council. Whereas when I was on Lewisham Council, you had that old committee system where all the members would vote on chairman of committees and that, and where, before the council, chairman of the group would go through the council agenda page by, and you could get things referred back and you could have a debate in the group. Albert's control of that group is suffocating, and quite frankly, you know, that's one of the reasons why Barry Bowles ends up saying, I'm giving up as chairman of the Hall Green constituency, because all I end up doing is carrying out unpopular policies laid down by Albert. Because Albert doesn't want to listen. Now, you know, that is an example of where...
So where are you in terms of the cabinet system that Birmingham has? I mean, it has 77 councillors. It clearly has to have some sort of leadership.
Yeah, but you can have leadership under the committee system. What happened was that the whole of the Labour group elected the chairman and vice chairpersons of each committee, as well as the group officers, as well as the leader of the council. Then the secretary would put up a list of suggestions based on your preferences, who should go on each committee, you know, and that would be discussed at the group, and there'd be changes made and such like. And then you had the committee meetings. You didn't have this system of cabinet and scrutiny and such like, because what happens is in the cabinet now on Birmingham, the powers of patronage are enormous. You know, I campaigned against elected mayors, and one of the reasons I argued was there is enough centralisation and power concentrated in the leader of the council at the moment, you know, irrespective of whether it's Albert or anybody else, in terms of patronage. If you have a mayoral system, it'd be even more so. But it's not healthy, because what happens is Albert can buy people off. You know, the reason why Albert survives is, you know, because, you know, he will sit there before, well, if I put that person there as chairman of scrutiny, I don't want him in my car, I'll put him as chairman of scrutiny, and he will get his salary for doing that, and then I can count on his votes plus the vote of so and so, or his friend. That's the way he does it. And as an operator myself, I can smile on that, but that is not a good way of running a council like Birmingham. And it's one of the reasons why we ended up in this bloody ridiculous situation with Kerslake. And one of the reasons why the quality of officers is not good, because the dividing line between officers and politicians, it's just too much power has been centralised. It is not good. It's not good in any system. It's not good in Westminster. Certainly not good in local government. You want to bring the best of people out. You want to bring the people, all the talents. And in my experience, when you had a committee system, everybody felt they had an equal chance. You would have the housing committee, and you'd have the agenda, and you would have cross-party votes on various issues, which were not, deeply political, but they were, housing issues. And why shouldn't you do that? Why shouldn't you do it? Because otherwise, everything is decided at the centre and it disseminates down, and then you end up in a situation where somebody like Barry says, "I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not being Albert Bore's bloody, taking his policies back to implement the things which I don't even agree with."
Kerslake's interesting from one point, isn't it? Because people think that Kerslake was, he was sent to do a job. There's argument for that.
There was a lot of payback with Kerslake. I mean, when he came to see me, he sat in my office with his secretary round a table, and he kept falling asleep. Quite literally, he kept falling asleep. And he didn't fall asleep because I was speaking in a very low tone. I had quite a loud voice, and people tend not to fall asleep when I'm talking. He kept falling asleep, and he said at the end, I've had a very hard day. I said, "Well, I think you better go into bed." And his secretary laughed. He said, "Yeah, I've had 2 hours in front of Margaret Hodge, Public Accounts Committee." But as I say, he kept falling asleep, but he definitely had preconceived ideas.
That is my view.
Yeah, he did.
But,
he did.
And his public engagements were, I think, a farce. And the one that he did in the library was clearly hijacked by the Sutton Coldfield sort of independence group, who talked all about green waste and various other things.
Well, he had his agenda, and there was a sizable bit of payback, and he was doing the bidding of his minister. And
has he been a former leader himself at Sheffield? The story goes
chief executive, and he'd applied for Birmingham, and Albert had rode him out. Yeah, and there was
Is
payback.
there some payback?
Yeah.
Is that a personal payback?
Oh yeah, I'm sure it was.
Yeah. How extraordinary.
Well, not really. Why people do,
Well,
human nature being what it is.
Right. Okay. In terms of the local authority, though, and in terms of the way it's going, in terms of local, how do you see the vibrancy of Labour politics? Because for me, as a Labour voter, a Labour supporter, an on and off Labour activist, and an on and off Labour member, the party is moribund in Birmingham. It strikes me. The Birmingham Labour Party, as such, you don't hear about it. All you hear about is the deals being done and the various things and various people who are contriving to, climb up that slippery slope, to getting to be something. Where do you feel it's going? I mean, or has it gone? And is it rescuable in your view?
Birmingham Labour Party, I don't know. I think the Birmingham Labour Party, as you say, I don't know if it's functioning. I don't know.
Well, I do wonder, because you can't find anything about it. You can't find minutes about it. It's very difficult to get information about it.
Yeah, the impression I get is it's just a unit of the party that is basically an offshoot of the regional Labour Party in Raleigh and the paid officials.
Yes.
You know, and the Birmingham Labour Party, you know, will do the vetting of candidates and things like that. But in terms of having a distinctive policy line, I think to a large extent that's dead and buried now, and died almost with the conflicts of the 80s, and has never really come back from there. And to be perfectly honest, I've got my doubts whether it ever will. Having said that, I'm not sure that it's exceptional, because the Greater London Labour Party, which used to be a very prominent organisation, I think is a similar position.
There are two things that I really wanted to focus on in terms of your views. We had Dick Knowles, who was a colourful individual and leader of the Labour Party, a man who you described as you could do business with.
And a man of substance.
And
also, you don't just have to go down to the city centre and you will see the whole rebirth of Birmingham, which was initiated under Dick Knowles.
Right. Fans of Sir Albert would say that he was the economic guru at the back of that, and pushing the ICC and all of the city centre views. Do you have a view about where Birmingham City Council has gone in terms of putting what many people would think too many of his eggs in the one basket?
No, Albert was... Dick Knowles had around him at the time John Charlton, who I had a lot of time for, and Clive Wilkinson. These were strong politicians who I have respect for. They had ability. I was on the same political wavelength as them, but I got on well with them and I respected them. Albert had traditionally been the leader of the left. You say Albert was the economic guru behind them. Some would say Albert sold out to Dick and his people in order to get a position. You pay your money and take your choice. I don't know. But certainly so far as the rebirth of Birmingham, the rebuilding, you know, of the whole city centre, Theresa Stewart was the leading opponent of it, because the economics were that in order to put up 30 million of local money, you've got 170 million of European money. So you've got 200 million, 170 million came from Europe. Dick, I think he was totally right, and Clive and John thought that was a good value for money. Theresa Stewart said, no, you should spend that £30 million on improving the schools in the city. Well, I think that's daft economics, because yes, the schools needed to be improved, but were you going to turn down 170 million, leverage 30 million to 170 million in order to, rebuild the whole of the centre of Birmingham? I think the decision that Dick and his colleagues made was the right one, and I think she was wrong.
Of course, a lot of people would say that, of course, the Birmingham Education Department was starved of funds over a long period of time because of that, and also some of the problems that came from social care, which have now all come back to sort of haunt them.
I don't think you can put all that down to £30 million of local money.
No, but it was not having a priority, they would say. That would be the argument of the Theresa Stewart lobby and others.
They would say that, wouldn't they?
But interestingly enough, she kept close, didn't she? She kept. Albert stayed in the close to. Is it just an argument of keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer?
Well, it might be, but Albert's a great survivor, and I will happily pay tribute to him for that. I just feel that he's been there too long, and he can't see the wood for the trees now, and power has become so concentrated. Albert has become part of the problem now.
And he's the block in the road, which means that the government can't do business with Birmingham because he's the roadblock in the middle, or part of it.
It's not just a question that the government can't do business with Birmingham. I think the Birmingham Labour Group can't function properly and bring out the best of its talents without some new ideas and new thinking and a breath of fresh air.
Boundary changes, briefly. Birmingham's going to, in all probability, lose 20 councillors, and we're going to move to some sort of system of either single elections or changes of boundary, whatever. Where do you stand on that?
I'm opposed to it. I think, if Kerslake is saying, I made this perfectly plain to him, if you're saying Birmingham's got problems, those problems, and I wouldn't dispute it's got problems, but those problems aren't caused by the way the councillors are elected or the size of the wards. They are big wards. They're 3 councillors for an average of 17 to 20,000 electors. Whereas in London, where I was a councillor, it was 3,000 per councillor, and in Birmingham it's 6,500. But that is not the problem, in my opinion. That is not the problem at all. The much bigger problem is over the structure of the council and the concentration of power and the sort of things I've just been saying to you. Not over, whether you tinker around and have single member wards or that. To use an old parlance, it's like rearranging the furniture on the Titanic when there's a bloody great hole in it. It's irrelevant.
Well, I'd like to say thank you. I'm mindful that taken a lot of your time, and I'm extremely grateful. And I note from the John Golding book that he said you were an assiduous note taker and the keeper of the notes for the St Ermines group.
Certainly was, yeah.
Do you still have those notes, and are they ever to be likely to be published or put into the public domain? Because that area of time, or is that to go into your own autobiography or biography or whatever?
They would donate it to the National Museum for Labour History
at Warwick.
At Preston, I think it was.
Oh, is it Preston? Right, okay. Warwick University has an archive, I know, but
they were passed there. They're all handed over and passed there.
Fine. And in terms of your own sort of legacy, what would you say, in a sentence, the thing you're most proud of having done as an elected Member of Parliament over your long parliamentary history?
Well, I haven't finished yet.
No, my apologies. To date.
Yeah, to date. I can't actually put my finger on one single thing. I can say what I did as a councillor. I can say, for example, right in the middle of my ward in Birmingham Ward, I got an open area turned into a mini park, and when I drive past it now, I'm delighted by the fact that an area which was at one time just used for dog walking is now a hugely popular local park, very well used, and absolutely great. I can also say that I got a brand new community centre built in my ward as well. I suppose up to now, if
opposition to foreign wars.
No. I can say the same thing about Birmingham, because I got the money for Joseph Chamberlain College. Because Joseph Chamberlain College, the principal there was Lynn Morris, and they were in that crummy old building that was asbestos ridden. And the plan was by Birmingham City Council to relocate the Balti Quarter from Ladypool Road down to Hayden Circus. And I told the council they were mad, and I had meetings with officers and such like, where in no uncertain terms I told them they were mad. But then what the plan was to relocate the Joseph Chamberlain College to the open green space in Cleveland Road down there, which would have taken out one of the few open spaces that there were in Sparkbrook, and just plonk the college down there, flog off the land they were on, plus the adjoining land. Anyway, I got all that stopped, and I got Prescott to agree that that college could be built at Hayden Circus, that the council, that land could be sold to the college at less than best value. That scuppered their plans for moving the Balti Quarter. That scuppered their plans for dumping the college, the new college in Cleveland Road, which saved that open space. And that meant that you've now got a magnificent brand new college in probably the most prominent position in the whole of Birmingham. So every time I drive past, I can think with some pride that were it not for me, that wouldn't have happened. How's that?
Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much.